Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. My guest today is Jacob Falkovich. He writes a blog called Put a Number on It, and you can find it by searching for Put a Number on It, and it's actually www.putanummonit. So put a num on it. So really great to have you on the show. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm excited to be here and chat.
Yeah. So I originally got in touch with you because you wrote this great tweet thread on free information principle by Carl Friston and its connection to psychedelics, and it was just very interesting for me. So I wanted to invite you on and kind of go deeper into it and put it into a podcast format. So how did you first start getting interested in this theory?
So the thing that initially turned me on is Scott Alexander, who writes Star Codex. He wrote a review of the book Surfing Uncertainty about this general idea that everything your brain does is trying to predict incoming inputs at different levels. So this predictive processing or predictive coding theory of the brain, that's really what it does, is makes predictions, it gets error signals coming in, compares them, and maybe it updates the higher level models. It gets too many errors. And then Scott became really fascinated, and also I did. It kind of felt like a simple idea, but once you start taking it a bit seriously, you notice how it touches on everything from explaining how you shoot a basketball to what depression is, to, like you said, machine learning, etc. And then I'm going to see more and more things converging on that idea. So people who are talking about psychedelics, and then even ideas, I don't know, Jordan Peterson's ideas about order and chaos, suddenly all of them are converging together. It is a bit, this is a good reason for caution here. Like if you have sort of very simple model that suddenly everything you see falls into it, that could be kind of dangerous. That maybe if we are all way overfitting and cramming too many things into this paradigm without really being careful about it. I've started writing a series of articles on the Ribbon Farm blog with Venkatesh about trying to cram basically all of social behavior into predictive processing. Because in Ribbon Farm, you have the permission to not be too scientifically rigorous. Everyone knows that's not the place for epistemic statuses. But yeah, so all of it is hard to tell how much of it is really true and how much of it is overfitting. But if any of this is true, it is very, very exciting.
And the thing that first drew me to it, I read an article in Wired about it, and it was right after I'd finished this book, Behave, by Robert Sapolsky. And in that book, he says that behavior is rewarded based on an external reward. And it seems like somewhat contrary to like an external dopamine reward. You receive this dopamine reward and then you feel great, and then you're motivated to do other challenges. And then something in the free information theory made it seem like they had a nuance to that, which is that all this information is coming in, so it's really about improving our ability to predict, or the purpose of thought is not to gain some sort of externally mediated reward, but it's actually to improve our ability to make predictions. Is that accurate?
Somewhat. So, I mean, ultimately, if you just sit and you only predict, you don't get anywhere. So there are two parts to it. The first part is you have some evolved priors. So let's say there are two bacteria, and one of them predicts that it's going to encounter a lot of sugar and a little acid. And the other one, and this prediction is not conscious, it's just something in it kind of causes it to act as if it anticipates and is well matched to that one. And the other one, something about its structure predicts a lot of acid and a little sugar. So the one that gets to eat the sugar and not get dissolved by the acid, that's the one that's going to reproduce. So we basically have in the hardware of our brains some priors like built in on a very hardware level. For example, my brain predicts that my body will stay at 98.6 degrees. It will predict that I will be socially popular and sexy and well-fed and safe from predators. So you can have those top-level priors, and if you manage to navigate yourself to such a world that that's really the signals that are coming in, then you feel very happy. And you can also cash this out as good predictions. The second part is predictions are only worth it in terms of predicting the consequences of your actions. So really you're trying to predict, like there are two ways to predict that I'm eating tasty pizza. One is just hallucinating it, but that's kind of like a limit of how far that gets you. And the other one is if I predict it very hard, I might have a model that says, oh, I can like stand up and walk to the pizza place and like hand them some money and they will give me pizza and then I will put it to my mouth. So you can make predictions come through by action. And that's kind of the core of what you're doing as an animal. So basically, as far as you care about building accurate models of the world, it's about, oh, if I understand the world, if I model it correctly, if I'm constantly like not surprised by things that are happening, it means I can act effectively in it and make things happen that my hyper priors want to happen.
And this gets into something I've been thinking a lot about recently, is about the difference between, we're having this conversation. The thing that I identify most with is this verbal capacity to express knowledge and communicate and understand and have a conversation. But then there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on within me that is unconscious and that I don't have any control over. For example, the alpha motor neurons that are innervating my tongue. I'm just giving them a high level command in order to speak, but all the millions of neurons that are going into that action of speech are not under my conscious control whatsoever. And so so what about this unconscious part? Unconscious versus conscious, like where does that fit in? Does it even matter whether we're conscious of these things, or because it seems like a lot of it comes from this intuition, this knowing that we have that's not verbal. But then where does this verbal capacity come in, or even this visionary capacity come in?
Yeah, well, so this sort of predictive processing is supposed to be happening at all levels. So maybe your conscious brain starts with the general prediction of, I'm going to say something about the difference between consciousness and unconscious systems. Now, then so it creates this very top level prediction. One level below it, you have a part that predicts, oh, I should be moving my mouth and my larynx and making sounds. And then some lower part is kind of generates phonemes and then kind of matches, oh, if you're saying the word tomato, that's weird. That's like, I didn't expect to be saying that word when talking about consciousness. If I'm saying some other word, I do. And then all the way down to a part that predicts, the muscle tension in your tongue to create the phoneme that you were thinking about. So let me just put my phone on silent here. I did not predict to be getting messages and I forgot to do it. I do also, kind of going back to the original thing about your prediction mostly guiding actions. I think that most of your unconscious systems are about guiding action. That's what's important. But then we have this reason capacity where you call it like system 2 or your consciousness. And that's the part that can think explicitly of like, oh, I care about having accurate models of the world. And then that part is always surprised by the fact that all of your unconscious systems are working against it. So I think you see it, for example, in political beliefs. Like, it doesn't really affect my life one way or another what my opinion is on the minimum wage. No one asked me. I'm not even a citizen of the US, I'm an immigrant, I'm not a senator, I don't have a political platform. So it really makes sense for me to say things about the minimum wage that would make me liked in my community, that would actually be effective, that will get me friends, it will get me laid. And then if you have this kind of conscious system of like, no, I care about true beliefs about the world, including about complex political, economical issues, that part is trying to figure out true things, whether or not they're actionable, and keeps being frustrated by your desire to be signaling for status and all the other things. Especially when you notice them in other people, like, don't you care about the truth? And it's like, well, Some part of you does.
Part of me cares about the truth, but a much deeper part of me cares about fulfilling basic needs of housing, food, sex, intimacy, all these different things. And all those things are mediated by this kind of status thing as well.
Yeah, that's actually like the question of what should I say about minimum wage to be popular in my social circle. That's a very difficult question that requires a very sophisticated model. It's not like a very obvious thing. It's not like you're being lazy by answering that question instead of, yeah, maybe answering that is a lot harder than having some Econ 101 or Marxism 101 answer to this.
Interesting.
Like your brain is not being lazy. It's actually solving hard questions when it's saying ignorant things about political issues.
And so this brings into mind, like, are the hardest things, are the hardest problems, or the hardest predictive things, are those things done more by this unconscious deeper layers of our body, or are they done more by the conscious? It seems to me by what you just said that it makes more sense that the conscious part takes on the easier questions and the unconscious takes on the deeper questions and the more difficult ones.
Well, necessarily. So I guess, like, if you can update some like really high level models, like the very idea that reality is not like you perceive it, that your models of reality are filtered by, you know, your evolved biases, your perception, etc. So you get there from anywhere, like from Buddhism to rationality to just sitting quietly and contemplating. That's a high level model that can then it can have massive impacts on everything else. And you're not gonna get there through intuition alone. Like I don't think a dog can get there. Maybe like there are really important things that you can only achieve once you can make some major impacts like that, or major updates to models like that.
Interesting.
Yeah, easy and hard is a weird kind of measure to apply to this. I don't know. That some things are obvious to some people and very hard for other people to grasp, and vice versa.
There could be a conversation we could have about the intervariability. So each, like within primates, and the difference between my brain, my gene expression in your brain, and the gene expression in your brain is larger than the entire difference between the human species and primates. So like there's greater inter-individual variancy between humans than there is for the entire species of apes versus the species of primates versus the species of humans. That's something I read in Robert Sapolsky. So we could talk about how something related to that in terms of free energy, or we could go down the path of psychedelics and what the relevance of is to psychedelics. What do you find more interesting?
So I think they both tie together because one of the main researchers of psychedelics is Robin Carhart Harris of, I think, the Imperial College in London. So he says that there's a thing you can measure about the brain from the outside called brain entropy, which is basically, I just put just like helmet of electrodes and basically measures what's the information content in your brain activity. So if there's some very predictable pattern in your brain, like the left side lights up, and then at the front side, and then the left side ends at the same frequencies, at the same power, that's very low entropy. And if it's like, you know, things light up in all different frequencies in an unpredictable way, that's very high entropy. So a dog has higher entropy than a worm. A chimpanzee has higher brain entropy than a dog. A human has higher entropy than a chimp, but a baby human has more brain entropy than an adult human. Also, you have lowest entropy when you're in a coma, higher in deep sleep, higher in REM or wakefulness, and the highest when you're experiencing a psychotic episode or on psychedelics.
So wait, I want to make that clear. So the highest entropy state is when you're on psychedelics or when you're in a psychotic episode.
Yes. And when you're very, very young. So this is that stable basically rhythms and patterns in your brain. From the inside, they feel like having a stable model of reality. Like you know how things look, and you perceive them a certain way. You know how things should behave. You're doing things, they come out as expected. And you don't learn a lot. So if your brain is high entropy, it also means that different parts of it are connected to each other, kind of like a lot more flexible. You have a lot fewer strong predictions about what is happening, but you have a lot of room to learn. And they say that the baby's brain is the most entropic in the animal kingdom because it's almost like your brain's hardware as a baby is set to knowing, okay, I live in a very, very complex world and I don't even know what sort of general models will fit. So some things maybe, like humans have a propensity to learn how to recognize faces quickly. So you probably have like a bit of built-in hardware about faces. But for a lot of other things, then like what you were saying, there's a big difference between us, although maybe not a lot if we listen to the same podcast and read the same book, is because we started as this babies with massively entropic brains who can then learn really different, very complex models of reality that aren't set too much ahead of time by just our hardware. And then as we get older, calcify and fall in more patterns that feel from inside like you know what's happening in the world. It's not necessarily bad thing. Except that you start accumulating, if your models aren't perfect, and they probably aren't because the world is very difficult and complex, you start accumulating error signals. You feel like confused and anxious, some things don't fit in. And then Carhart Harris says, well, take a bunch of psychedelics, your brain heats up, becomes entropic again, and then hopefully settles down into a better pattern that resolves some of the, errors that you've accumulated.
Yep.
And
so that's really interesting. It's about, it feels, I'm considering taking this intense psychedelic called Iboga. Have you ever heard of it before?
I think so. It's from an African plant, right?
Yeah.
It's called ibogaine.
Yeah, ibogaine is the derivative, the chemical derivative of it. Iboga is the root bark. And primarily, this isn't the reason that I'm going to use it, but most people use it in order to get off of opiates. And there's no detox associated with it. So you plan your withdrawal. You're about to withdrawal, and then you take ibogaine, a large dose of ibogaine, and puts you into a flood state. It's a very difficult trip, but you don't feel any withdrawal, and you come out of it 3 days later. Basically, I mean, it's 8 hours. The first 8 hours is like a waking dream state where some people go back through their entire history and all the traumatic issues that they've had. They go through it all. The second 8 hours is like kind of like an in-between state. And the third 8 hours is like, okay, I really want to go to sleep. I've been up for this long, but I can't go to sleep because it's a stimulant. And then 3 days later, you feel like you're a newborn. All of your wires are reset. For heroin, if you're on heroin, then your receptors are essentially reset to the beginning state. So it sounds interesting because it also brings to mind what is the difference between a bad trip and a good trip. And also like the psychotic break is like maybe somebody having a psychotic break is actually just learning a lot in that moment, but then it's very uncomfortable in that moment, but then eventually homeostasis reestablishes itself. And then it has more kind of insight into the nature of reality, and that reality itself is very complex. Because the thing I'm getting from what you just said is that reality itself is highly complex, highly nonlinear, and a baby's brain is born with high entropy because evolution has resulted in that, so that the baby can learn a lot really quickly and then eventually become an adult. But then that calcification process happens where our prediction is not accurate of reality. And then psychedelics, I wonder, has the guy that you mentioned, have they done any studies on people who take a lot more psychedelics, or people who meditate a lot, or people who do these kind of psychotechnologies, whether they have more predictive capability with their thoughts?
It's a good question. So I'm not sure. So there haven't been, I think, that many studies of like official academic studies of psychedelics in healthy people. So what Carhart Harris and also he recently did a collaboration with Friston are talking about is you have very obvious disorders of mental rigidity. So if you're addicted to smoking, you're gonna have this just rigid loop of craving a cigarette, giving in, then you feel bad, then you crave it again. If you're depressed, or even something like PTSD, you probably have some deep model in your brain that the world is unsafe and violent and you need to be very vigilant and defensive, and you fail to update. Like you're stuck in that mode even though you're back home among family and friends and your life is not actually threatened, but you keep reacting as though it is. And then there are some initial studies of MDMA for PTSD and psilocybin for smoking cessation and depression that say like, okay, the main thing they do is the same. They're gonna help you break out of those rigid patterns. Now you can say, okay, those are clinical problems. If you're depressed or PTSD, it's a serious issue. How about if you just have some persistent like models about, I don't know, that like the half of the country that are against you politically are really evil people and all of the bad things happen because of them, and you're going to suffer from a lot of confirmation bias. So like everything you see in the newspapers confirms that theory. So I would say, and this is not something that, I mean, the respectable researchers talking about, this is kind of me just running with it. You say, oh, that's somewhat like a disorder of mental rigidity. You have some fixed thoughts. You don't really integrate new information because with confirmation bias, you fit it all in and say, oh, look, the out group is being mean to the nice people again. And you kind of can't break out of it. And it's probably not making you very happy if you're just outraged on Twitter all the time. So, and I mean, it's not really making accurate predictions of the world. That's probably not the correct and true model of what's happening in the world, is that there are bad people who conspire against the good people. And that's the source. Like, that's a very simple model that's probably not actually that accurate. And so, yeah, I would say maybe those are places where psychedelics can help. I have a friend, Ayla, who took a lot of psychedelics and said that it helped her overcome a lot of, just like break out of a lot of rigid ideas that she had, both about like who she is and like the trauma associated with her family and all sorts of things.
This is the most interesting debate that I've had recently in my own head, is so I can take this iboga and it'd be very intense, be very difficult, probably confront most of my fears, confront a lot of difficult things that I've experienced. Or I could do a 10-day meditation retreat, probably have a similar experience. And then the difference between those kind of like, and I worry about the iboga because iboga has some heart complications, and I've been doing all these tests to make sure my heart is strong enough, but it turns out I think it'll be it's probably not going to, my heart is probably healthy enough to do it. But there is a sudden death from cardiac arrest that people experience from it. And so I'm thinking maybe do a meditation retreat instead of that. And then the difference between doing something like that and then turning my everyday life, doing meditation once a day, which I've done for a long time. It's not like I'm not doing that with things, but like the difference between little small changes in this entropy. And then it makes me think about all the little, so there's psychedelics like way up here at the top of the chain in terms of you take a large hero's dose of mushrooms, you're going to have an experience that will be it's like very reliable. It's very, it's just going to happen that you're going to confront something inside of your own being that may be very difficult, maybe full of ecstasy. And then, lower down the chain, there's all these other techniques we can do, like meditation, just focusing on the breath, redirecting our attention on the breath, chanting, dancing, all these little things. And those are like little tiny blips. But they seem, if I do a lot of them over time, it seems like I become less rigid. My It feels like I get younger as I get older. And so it's just interesting. I don't know if you have anything to say about that, about all that
Yeah.
stuff.
Also, there was an excellent article by, I think his name is Matthew Johnson, or maybe Michael Johnson. Yes, Michael E. Johnson of the Qualia Research Institute, about Neuro Annealing. So his model was like your brain accumulates kind of error signals. In this case, it's literal energy, kind of just like energy potential in your neurons. And then like the way if you have a sword, you go, you bash the hands on the head, then your sword accumulates stresses and little cracks. If you heat it up just above the melting point, it then cools back down to a more stable state. This is the same way you accumulate errors in your head, you can increase entropy and then settle back down. And he does mention all of those things. He says meditation does that, has a good theory of like why exactly it does that. He says because meditation, you basically observe your entire field of consciousness, but without positive or negative effect and without fitting it into any models. You just kind of observe it as it is. So saying, I'm observing this and this proves what I always thought about those people. Then kind of like increases entropy without like flowing down into any of the well-worn grooves of, you know, your aversions and attachments or your models of the world. And I think you also mentioned chanting and dancing, any sort of intense physical activity. And obviously the psychedelics can just like pumping in a lot of entropy from all over. I remember I listened just a while ago to a podcast, Sam Harris podcast with Dr. Roland Griffiths, who's running the Psychedelics Research Center at Johns Hopkins. It's the first major psychedelic research program in the US since the 60s. And he mentioned there was a study on long-term meditators. So they went to also like a week-long or a 10-day-long retreat for experienced meditators, and then half of them took psilocybin towards the end, and the half that did, I think, mentioned that they found the retreat more meaningful, it had more lasting impact on their lives, etc. So again, you can look up that study. Maybe the answer is ¿por qué no los dos?
And I have that thought has crossed my mind, and that'd probably be a good preparation to do the iboga and do the 10-day meditation retreat beforehand. But that's really interesting. Well, and there's such a, like, particularly among long-term meditators, the ones that I've worked with, is they kind of say psychedelics or substances are not really accepted means to spiritual insight. And it's interesting, and I wonder whether a lot of that is more because of kind of a habit that didn't get that entropy from all the practices they've done, or whether it's because it does actually have some truth to it. What do you think?
So I don't have that much experience with deep meditation. It is weird. I have friends who've done a lot of psychedelics, and they say, well, of course meditators say that. It's basic sunk cost fallacy, right? If they like knew they could like, instead of wasting 10 years like learning that stuff, they could have just like taken a bunch of acid. But then most of the people who are meditators are saying like, no, it is very different. Yep. We can't. And then probably the people who would have, like, I prefer to trust people like Sam Harris, seems to have decades of meditation and also large doses of psychedelics in his experience. And he does see them as somewhat complementary. I do think that your brain can also be too entropic. Like, you are smarter than a baby. You know things about the world.
Yep.
Kind of going, so I don't know, if something like depression or PTSD is a failure to break out of rigid modes of thinking, then something like psychosis is a failure to settle back into stable modes of thinking. So I don't know, maybe if you're an experienced meditator and you're not really noticing that, like, you do get signals in your life that, oh, you're confused about things. Like maybe you have a relationship with a close person and they just keep surprising you in negative ways. You keep having interactions that don't go well, or in your career or with other people. Like if you do notice signs of error, I would take that as a sign, I'm not understanding something, and maybe I've accumulated enough information from all those bad surprising interactions that I need to hit my brain up and let them integrate. And if you're not experiencing all of that, then I don't know, maybe your brain is doing fine. You're successfully minimizing free energy and predicting inputs.
Interesting. And I guess either is there I'm sure psychologists would have something to say about this, but is there a way to do a self-evaluation on whether your brain is in that kind of, whether your brain no longer needs entropy in order to fit yourself into a successful, healthy life, or whether there are some things that are needed? For me, when I ask myself that question of like, yeah, there are a few things in my life where I'm not, there's something blocking me from understanding it. And previously when I faced these blocks, it's so interesting because it seems so difficult and challenging to break through them. But most of the time when you actually understand them and you dissolve these blocks, it just happens very quickly and harmlessly. And it's just like, oh, that's what I've been doing. And then it leads to this behavior, which in many ways, like that happens a lot in psychedelics. But the issue with psychedelics is something you talked about earlier, which is that it's so so much at one time that it's difficult to, 3 days later when you've stabilized again, to actually, at least with the conscious mind, to bring that in and be like, this is what I learned, and like actually take what you learned and then bring it into life.
Yeah, I think also, so once you take psychedelics, then I guess you are a bit more vulnerable to updating towards what you actually experience, like in that state when your mind is more open. So it's like a big example for me, which turned out to be very positive because all my experiences were in a very good setting. Now, I was like, I'm in an open relationship and I was feeling some jealousy. And I was trying to think, okay, like some part of me understands that like jealousy is kind of an evolutionary vestige, that there's really not a lot of actual risk that I will, raise a child that doesn't share my genes because someone like impregnated my wife, etc. And I still felt the jealousy and I had the tension. And then I think I was on psychedelics and I started cuddling with a guy, and like both of them looking very happy and smiling at me. And I didn't like pay too much attention to it at the time. I was like, oh, this is cool, they're cuddling. And then a few months later, I like realized I stopped feeling jealousy, at least as much as I did before, which obviously makes being in an open relationship a lot more pleasant and easy. But then I could also imagine, oh, what if I'd been in a situation where like I would have seen something that would have triggered jealousy and I would have experienced that as also being negative. Like I could have actually just updated in the other way and resolved this tension by saying, oh no, everything I think cognitively about jealousy, how it like doesn't make sense in the world of birth control and genetic testing and trust in your wife, etc. No, that's actually wrong. I should actually just go with my intuition.
Yeah, this is something I've noticed, and I've seen it a lot in San Francisco, because I believe that it's impossible to live as a human being without creating an in-group and an out-group. I think like it's built into us to now the maybe the choice that we have is how small the in-group is or how big the out-group is, or that's but it seems that it is a basic nature of a human being to create an in-group and an out-group. And so it does seem like in San Francisco there are going to be new cults that are getting started because of this newfound, it's been going on since the 60s, but it seems like we're coming back into it, where these experiences, particularly if they're mixed with this type of PTSD or early childhood trauma, and then you add psychedelics on top of it, then creates a intuition-based group where everybody's an in-group, and it depends on how tight that group is or how open they are and stuff like that. But it does seem like that is going to happen more often. Might just be a guess of mine. But it's something about this intuition and like psychedelics, then maybe just increasing our ability, our affinity towards a particular value that we already have. And then going further down that path of that value. So maybe if you gave psychedelics to Ku Klux Klan members, would they just get more firm in their beliefs about who is the in-group and who is the out-group. I wonder, that'd be interesting.
Maybe the answer is you take a Ku Klux Klan member and a Black Panther member, and you sit them in like a very cozy room and give both of them MDMA.
Yeah.
And so, some people ask, what would you put on a billboard above the highway? Okay, take MDMA with the out group. Feel unconditional love for the people who sneer at you on Reddit.
That would be very interesting to see a Ku Klux Klan member and a Black Panther member taking MDMA together. That would be, feel like it would be very tense. Yeah.
See, this is like, why isn't science doing that experiment? Why are we like stuck? There's like psychology. Why is psychology, digging for like grand priming or power posing or whatever, instead of giving KKK and Black Panther people MDMA? It's like, are we wasting our time with all this nonsense?
Yeah, I do agree to some extent that it's just ridiculous that, because this ibogaine is like extremely powerful for help. It's not a cure, but it is extremely powerful for people to get off of heroin. And it should, and MDMA is extremely powerful for PTSD and all these different things. And it's like way beyond the rates at which just normal therapy is doing for these conditions.
Yeah, I don't know. There is sort of sense in being guided by the Hippocratic principle of first do no harm. So I understand why people are. Yeah, so I do get a sense of, for example, a lot of people that I know, like whenever I write about psychedelics or something, I often get responses about like, "Oh, aren't you worried that you'll take psychedelics and start believing in woo?" Or something like, "Oh, your rationalist atheism will go with nothing." And my thought is always like, no, if you're a rationalist atheist that spend a lot of time thinking about this, you have the slack and basically the robustness to take some risks with your brain. I feel like, my life is pretty good. I have like a good career. I have good friends. I feel like I have a good grasp of the world and learning things. A lot of my friends also. And most have a tendency, like once your life is pretty good, to be more risk averse. I think, oh, why would I want to, if just my day-to-day kind of experience of the world, like I'm always at a 7 out of 10. I never get really sad and upset. Like, why would they want to risk it? So yeah, the people who are in the most trouble are the ones who turn into alternative things like ibogaine. I have a lot of friends whose lives seem to be going pretty well, except for a couple of minor things. And they go to therapy a lot. And can I say, like, do you think the therapy is effective? It's certainly not harmful.
Interesting. Yeah.
And get a sense of, they actually probably don't want anything too potent, because if your life is like overall pretty well.
Interesting. And this kind of gets into what motivates people to do really, become externally very successful or kind of achieve high places of status. It seems like a lot of them are motivated by kind of intense experiences that things are not okay as they are, and they need to prove themselves and kind of show that there is a reason that, and it seems like a lot of these things that kind of come from these experiences of trauma and stuff. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I feel quite a big disconnect between myself and almost everybody else who's interested in that stuff, in that I think my life has been pretty charmed. I don't think I have a lot of trauma. I'm very low on neuroticism. I don't deal with a lot of negative emotion. So when people who are into Buddhism or psychedelics or anything, they start from the premise of life is suffering. And I always feel like, but is it though? I mean, I don't know. It's pretty good. Like suffering, I don't know. There's not that much suffering. And yeah, and I also get the sense of, and I feel like I'm not very ambitious in my kind of day job career. And because I have a strong desire to like drop my current nice job that I'm good at and is reasonably lucrative and gives me a lot of free time to read random papers about psychedelics. I have a strong desire to drop it and do a startup that has like a 10% chance of being massive and 90% chance of being a failure. So yeah, I'm personally approaching this out of the curiosity and long-term thinking. Like, well, I don't know, we might all live for a long time, even longer than we think. So there are kind of important questions about, you know, the real quality of your experience. It's worth being curious about it. But for me, it doesn't come out of a strong need to fix something that is wrong in the world or in me. And so maybe I'm like less driven than other people who have that. And it does seem that most people who are deeply into those sort of exploration are driven by like a wound that needs healing, something like that.
That's really interesting.
I don't know, what's your motivation for getting into this? Now you've mentioned on some podcasts that you're driven primarily by curiosity and the search for truth.
No, it's also got wounds that need healing as well. And there are just certain things in my life that are just not that they haven't been updated, that there's these models that are mostly unconscious that are very old, and just are not adapting themselves to what is required. And as I get older, they become more and more challenging to deal with. Like when I was younger, they weren't a big deal. But now they're starting to get more and more of a big deal. And it's like, I want to find resolution for these things. So that's my main, and also curiosity. I'm intensely curious as to a lot of different stuff that has no practical value in my life. So I guess I would say both, but I think the stuff that got me into particularly, it's hard because I've been in therapy since I was eight years old. So I've always had this overlay of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy and of that how does the mind work and stuff like that. But I rejected a lot of it and actually found my way into meditation and yoga as a part of that rejection. And now I'm going back into that. So it's it's complicated for me, I'd say. Yeah.
There's also, I do have somewhat of a transhumanist motivation. I think that like, things can be like way better. But like a Nick Bostrom was a philosopher who mostly writes about existential risk and all the ways that, you know, we can make ourselves go extinct very soon. He also has a short essay called Letter from Utopia. So it's like a letter to the people of today, you know, the people who like so wise and blissful and integrated that we can't even approach that. And kind of get a sense that, yes, the goal isn't to bring, I mean, it is an important goal to like bring everybody who's suffering to the level of well-being of, I don't know, and like accomplished the person in the Western world who's also like mindful and in a happy relationship, but also it's like a lot of upside that's worth reaching for. Really a lot beyond what we currently consider to be a very happy life or a happy community.
Do you think, this is a question that I always struggle with, is it important to elicit your goals and make them very clear, or this goes into the what we've been talking about, is reality so nonlinear and so difficult to predict that it might actually make more sense to not really make your goals clear, because reality will just make meats of them, and then maybe you're focusing on those goals will then make you ignore other parts of life that could have been an opportunity?
It's a good question. I don't know if there's really hesitate on something like this to kind of give one blanket answer. Again, for example, like for me, again, going back, Letter from Utopia doesn't have a lot of detail. It's almost like a template just to say like, hey, more is possible. And then you can use it to fill in what you think Utopia would be like. And this could be a useful question. You're like, okay, I mean, in Utopia, do we have, I don't know, do we have like, are people Catholic in Utopia? Does that feel like it fits? Are people capitalist in Utopia? So it's not like a very particular rigid goal to strive forward to. It's kind of like a reminder of, keep thinking about the upside. For some like more specific things, it is important to stick to goals. I don't know, I'm a bit of a skeptic about, I have a friend of mine, Spencer Greenberg, who gave a talk about intrinsic values. He said, well, there's things that you pursue like money because, they're just instrumental. You just need money to achieve other things. But then if you like really look deep in your soul, you will find your like true intrinsic values, the things you really care about. And then like, well, some of them you can get other people to help you. So for example, if your goal is, to help the most needy people in the world and be an effective altruist, people will cooperate with you on that. And I'm actually very skeptical that if you dig really deep into your motivation system and peel off the layers, you will discover something like helping the people of the world. I think you will discover some hardware circuits that, like at the base level, there's just some like built-in hardware circuits that are just optimizing for the level of a neurotransmitter somewhere. And above them, you're probably like your real goals are, inclusive genetic fitness or survival or something like that. I'm somewhat skeptical of taking some goals and believing that, this goal I have that actually cashes out in terms of things happening out in the world, measurable outcomes, changes in society, is in some sense like a true and deep goal. Like, my personal inclination is to always leave room for updating and changing those. Kind of seeing them as useful targets, but not as the be all and end of what you really want.
Interesting. Well, cool. That seems like a good place to wrap up. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And how can people find out more about your writing? You
can follow me on Twitter at Yashkaf, Yashkaf. I've recently got really into Twitter, and probably almost everything else creative or interesting that I come up with, which is not a lot, but whatever I do come up with will probably end up in as a link on Twitter.
I'll put a reminder here to put the original tweet thread that you wrote about this.
Yes, hopefully it will turn into a more coherent blog post with illustrations, but without a fixed timeline.
That's cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Sure, it was a pleasure.